Hi, I'm Cory Doctorow, and I want to start this recording by congratulating you on surviving the pandemic. Millions didn't. We did. Through some combination of competence and luck and caution and privilege, we lived through it. And this is cause for relief. I mean, as I record this, I'm 2 weeks into my first Pfizer vaccine dose, and I'm still feeling the elation. But that elation is tempered by dread, because the pandemic wasn't the war. It was just the first battle in the wars to come, the opening salvo. Because as I record this, 2.5 billion people in the world's 130 poorest countries have received 0 doses. And in the 85 poorest countries in the world, they are projecting that they will not be fully vaccinated anytime before 2023. And despite all of that, the WTO, as I record, is poised to turn down requests from countries in the global south to make their own vaccines under suspended patent protections so they can ramp up their domestic production. And billionaires like Bill Gates, well, they're endlessly repeating the racist lie that it wouldn't matter if they could produce their own vaccines because poor brown people lack the technical sophistication they need to make a safe vaccine, despite the fact that many of the countries who are petitioning the WTO right now already manufacture vaccines. Indeed, the world's largest vaccine manufacturing facilities are in the world's poorest countries. Now, not only is this denial of vaccine a humanitarian tragedy, it's also an epidemiological suicide pact. Because every person who gets the virus turns into a COVID factory, making trillions of copies of the vaccine as their cells are hijacked by it. I beg your pardon, making trillions of copies of the virus as their cells are hijacked by it. And sometimes those copies, they have flaws. We call those flaws mutations. And sometimes the mutations, they make the virus more dangerous, easier to catch, and more lethal, and more resistant to the vaccines that the rest of us are able to get. To sum up the situation, in order to protect the profits of monopolists of the pharma industry, we are allowing those tax-dodging multinational corporations to block the public use of the publicly subsidized research products that they manufacture, while they simultaneously threaten the future of our species and our civilization. This situation is ghastly, but it's hardly novel. It's just an accelerated version of the processes that created the climate emergency. The subjugation of the public interest to a small coterie of the super wealthy and the enablers who serve them. This is a terrifying and demoralizing proposition. I'll freely grant that. Terror and demoralization, they beget paralysis. That's the worst part of all. The part that makes it seem like a horror movie. The kind of horror movie where you're on a bus that's hurtling towards a cliff, and no matter how loud you scream, you can't get the driver to turn the wheel. Now, horror movies are funny things, because while they often start with these demoralizing, terrifying scenarios, all of that fear and heartbreak is in service to setting up the audience for a turn, the moment at which the heroes recognize that no one is coming to save them, and they have to save themselves. Up until that moment, every time the monsters draw blood, it is part of the inevitable devastation that will end in their slaughter. But once they make common cause, putting aside their petty grievances, after they start to fight back, then the losses that they sustain are just the price of rescuing themselves. After that moment, they buy hope with their blood. The difference between hope and despair is not whether the monsters are at your door. The difference between hope and despair is whether you're prepared to fight the monsters. What's the difference between utopia and dystopia? It's not where everything is going right or wrong. Everything is always going to be going wrong. That's the price we pay for living in this universe where entropy is unappealable, where the second law of thermodynamics prevails, where physics is not something you get to argue with. The difference between utopia and dystopia is not the difference between things falling apart and hanging together. It's the difference between hope and despair. We aren't anywhere near through this pandemic, and yet we are all so very exhausted. And it is tempting to surrender ourselves to fate rather than turning and fighting. Exhaustion isn't the price of adversity. It's the price of despair. Because there is nothing more renewing, nothing more exhilarating, nothing better than refusing to surrender to fate, to fight for a better future. What does it mean for us as artists to turn and fight and demand a better future? To be sure, there is plenty of room in this world for art that bears witness to the situation we're living in now. We will always have space in our art for a Guernica that shows the horror of the moment. But for artists and our audiences, there is a great void that depicts some kind of story of hope. I'm not talking about art that depicts the horror of what happened, nor about art that depicts some kind of easy final victory in which all of our problems are put behind us. But rather, I'm talking about art that confronts the crisis head on, making the climate emergency and the emergencies that it will attend at fight for every millimeter that it takes from us, making inequality apologists defend every single cent. Stories where the losses we know that we will take mean something. After all, the power of a futuristic story is not in predicting the future, it's in making the future. Despite the idiotic claims of some of my peers in the science fiction industry, science fiction does not predict the future. I mean, thank God science fiction does not predict the future, because if the future is predictable, then it's knowable. And if it's knowable, then it's foreordained. And if it's foreordained, then it's immutable. And if it's immutable, nothing we do matters. Predicting the future isn't just useless, it's harmful. It can inspire others to fatalistic inaction. Instead, science fiction can make the future. Science fiction can imagine a Star Trek communicator so that a generation later, Motorola engineers invent the flip phone. We can reach into the present, we can pluck out some latent techno-socio phenomenon, and we can spin a tale in which that one thing is the dominant factor in our whole world. Not because that's a prediction or even a proposal for how we should be, but because it can be a diagnostic tool. After all models are inaccurate, but some are useful. When your doctor swabs your throat and rubs the swab in a petri dish and comes back a few days later and looks through the microscope, she is creating a model of your body, a model that is not accurate, a model in which only one fact about your body, whatever that is growing at the back of your throat, is the only fact that matters. And that distorted model is the thing that allows her to understand what's latent in your body and treat it. Science fiction can provide a window into the emotional lived experience of people who are experiencing technological interventions that is latent in our world around us. It can warn, it can inspire, and it can give us a vocabulary for talking about what we want our future to be. So put that together. We have inspiration over prediction, usefully inaccurate models, hope as the process of fighting and refusing to be demoralized. And it can look like this. I just turned in my latest novel. It's a book called The Lost Cause, a science fiction novel about truth and reconciliation with white nationalist militias after a Green New Deal transition. Now, the prehistory of that novel, the stuff that happens before the first page, it all happens now. And that was a choice my editor wasn't sure about when I first sent him the outline. He thought it might make the novel dated somehow because the predictions about the future wouldn't come true. But once I explained that these weren't predictions, but rather they were contrafactuals, what might have been, to name the opportunity that is slipping through our fingers right now, he completely got it. It starts with this weird political moment, a moment in which the two main parties in Canada, both effectively center-right parties, are in absolute disarray. One of them is mired in scandal, the other is having a leadership fight, and that means that the Social Democratic Party, that have never won a federal election, they sneak through the middle. And they win a federal election. They form the government and name the prime minister. And what's more, because those Social Democrats were so sure that they couldn't possibly win the election, they have arranged things so that their leader at the time was a symbolic leader, someone who could fight a symbolic fight. It's a woman who is a member of the Road Allowance Métis, a group of radical Indigenous Canadian people who trace their roots back to Louis Riel, a great rebel leader in Canadian history. And this prime minister, she takes office just as Calgary, one of the great Canadian cities, is being washed off the map by a flood. Now, that's hardly speculative at all. You see, Calgary is in the middle of the Canadian oil patch, And its politics are dominated by the politics of the Canadian tar sands. The tar sands are the filthiest, worst oil in the world, the most environmentally damaging oil in the world. And like every petrostate, all you need to run the politics there is to have a hole in the ground and surrounded by people with guns. After all, that's all you need to make an oil economy run. So in Calgary today, whenever a developer says, hey, can I build some condominiums or an apartment block or a commercial building on this floodplain that floods every year, the city says, sure, why not? Let the market sort it out. Calgary in this story is finally swept away, washed off the map, and that radical prime minister has her moment. She allocates the capital needed to relocate the city, the entire city, to higher ground, to a more rational version of itself. And building on that success, she initiates projects to relocate every coastal city in Canada because they know that they're all going to be washed away by rising seas. They build high-speed rail lines to reproduce the most common aviation routes so they can ground those airplanes. They reorient the entire productive capacity of the Canadian nation and all of its people, resources, and capital to setting up the country to rise to the emerging climate challenge. Now, this is something like a war footing, and millions who join that effort, they call themselves the Blue Helmets. And they're joined by thousands of people abroad who flock to Canada to join the Blue Helmets in something that they call the Canadian Miracle. It's a little like the Spanish Civil War where the irregulars came to fight for the site of right, except in this case, they win. And those Blue Helmets, having done amazing things in Canada and created the Canadian Miracle, they fan out all over the globe, going not just home to their own countries, but to every part of the world where help is needed. And they form this open, collaborative, global, anti-hierarchical movement of people who don't fear the future anymore. Not because the future isn't fearsome, but because they are no longer in that horror movie nightmare of being in a bus, barreling towards the cliff edge, the driver unwilling to swerve no matter how loud you scream. They did the assessment. They know that they will face massive losses. They know that those losses are unavoidable and that every loss that can be avoided will be clawed back from that legacy of denial and disregard that is the legacy of the generations that came before us. This is a story in which tens, even hundreds of millions of people still die ghastly, terrible, senseless deaths. But it's not a story of helplessness and impotence. It's the story of doing something that means something that gets us somewhere better. There's an old Irish joke whose punchline goes, if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here. When you're in the situation where you can't get to where you are because of where you're starting from, it's not funny. But pretending that you don't have to go somewhere else before you can start, that doesn't make it any easier to cope with. Imagine life among the Blue Helmets. It means imagining hard work, but also camaraderie, a sense of accomplishment, a world of places to visit, a world in transformation, a world where, say, your job-making prefab low-carbon slabs to rebuild all the coastal cities involves working long hours when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing and there's renewable energy going spare. But it's also a world where when the energy isn't available, everyone gets the day off. And smart, humane social technology finds you people to relax with and things to do in that fluid improvisational mode that most of us haven't experienced the joy of since we were small children. It's a world of abundance and leisure, as well as a world of hard work and terror. A world where the grim reality of the climate emergency is confronted and where sweetness is found in the interstices. It's a resilient world. Now, I don't think we're going to get to that world because it's not a prediction, it's a dream. It's one of hundreds of dreams that we can all have together, dreams that confront the climate emergency and then keep going. We need those dreams. We need the dreams that show us that we don't have to wait for the bus to go over the cliff. The dreams that show us that if we stop covering our eyes in terror, we might see a way out. The art that we make about the emergency and our response to it won't predict that response, but it might inspire it. Thank you.